December 10, 1978, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York. One of the most notorious robberies in American history took place. It became one of the most brazen heists ever carried out on U.S. soil. The robbers made off with roughly $5 million in cash, along with a large quantity of jewelry and precious stones worth $875,000, an amount that today would be worth more than $26.7 million. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery ever committed on American soil. The crime would become known as the Lufthansa Heist. But to understand how it happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the 1970s. A man named Peter Gruenwald had an idea. He wanted to rob JFK Airport. Peter already knew the airport well. He and his close friend Louis Werner had previously pulled off a smaller theft there, walking away with a substantial amount of cash without getting caught. That success gave Peter an appetite for something bigger. Not thousands, millions. Peter and Louis both worked in the cargo department of a German airline at JFK. Peter handled valuable cargo, including cash and precious stones. Louis worked with ordinary passenger baggage. Their first robbery had been made possible by manipulating the baggage handling system from inside their own offices. But the FBI investigation never connected either man to the crime. Instead, innocent employees were questioned and suspended while the investigation continued. Peter learned his lesson. They couldn't use the same trick twice. Security around cargo transportation had also become tighter as technology improved. And this time, Peter wasn't thinking small. He wanted a much bigger score. Peter eventually told Louis he had something important to discuss after their shift. When they met, he revealed his plan. Their company had won a contract to transport large amounts of US currency from Europe back to America through JFK. The money had been spent by American travelers overseas and was now being shipped home. The shipment arrived once a month, and once it landed at JFK, it was collected by Brinks and taken to American banks. Brinks vehicles would already be waiting when the aircraft arrived. The money would be loaded and driven straight to the banks, with New York City police providing additional protection. On paper, the system was secure. But Peter had noticed a weakness: delays. Sometimes a shipment from Europe would arrive late, very late. And if the money couldn't be taken to the banks that night, it had to stay at the airport until morning. That meant it went into a secure vault inside the building. The vault contained millions in cash, along with other valuables waiting to be transported. Normally, nothing was supposed to remain there for more than 24 hours. But Peter saw an opportunity. If a shipment was delayed overnight, he could break into the storage facility and take the money before Brinks arrived the next morning. It was a simple idea. The problem was Louis. Peter called him and explained the plan. Louis thought it was far too dangerous. This wasn't their first small theft anymore. They were talking about millions of dollars. If they were caught, the police would come after them hard. Louis wanted no part of it. Peter eventually backed down. He needed Louis. Without him, pulling off a robbery of this size would be almost impossible. So for the moment, the plan was dead. At least, that's what Peter thought. Because Louis had other ideas, he had quietly decided to take the plan for himself. There was another reason. Louis had a serious gambling problem. After their first theft, he had gambled away his entire share. Now he was deep in debt, and the man he owed the most money to was Martin Krugman. Louis saw a way out. If he could turn Peter's idea into a real robbery, he could take a larger share of the money and clear his debts. So he went to Krugman, but he told him a lie. He claimed the idea was his. In reality, he'd stolen it from Peter. Krugman loved the idea. He told Louis not to worry, he could handle it. But once Krugman got home and actually started thinking about the robbery, he realized there was a problem. He didn't know how to plan a job this complicated. He needed someone else. And one name came to mind: Henry Hill. Henry was already an experienced criminal. He had been involved with New York crime crews since he was 17. Over the years, he'd taken part in robberies, drug trafficking, and even murder. But planning wasn't Henry's strength. He was better at following a plan than creating one. Give him clear instructions, and he'd carry them out. So when Krugman approached him, Henry agreed to help, but Henry quickly reached the same conclusion. They still needed someone who could design the robbery, someone who knew how to put all the pieces together, and Henry knew exactly who to call: James Burke, better known as Jimmy the Gent. James Burke was a brilliant robbery planner. He was also ruthless, extremely ruthless. Cross him, and you could end up dead. Henry had worked with Burke for years, so he went straight to him and laid out the idea. Burke agreed. And from that moment, the robbery became a serious operation. But there was one thing Burke needed to do first: get permission. Burke was closely connected to the Lucchese crime family, which at the time was led by Anthony Corallo, known as Tony Ducks. Major criminal operations couldn't simply happen without the mafia knowing about them. So Burke took the plan to Paul Vario, an underboss in the Lucchese family. Vario listened, then he approved it. But there was a catch. The robbery would take place on Bonanno territory, and in the mafia world, territory mattered. One family couldn't simply walk into another family's territory and carry out a major job without permission. JFK was Bonanno territory. So the Bonanno family had to be informed. They agreed to let the robbery happen, but they wanted one of their own men there during the job. His role was simple. He would make sure the money was counted honestly. If the robbery brought in $100 million, nobody could lie and claim it was only $50 million when it came time to divide the proceeds. There was one more family that needed to know. The Gambinos. They also had interests at JFK, so they were brought into the plan as well. Now everyone was on board. Burke could finally start planning, and he did it from a bar he controlled called Robert's Lounge. Its basement was also where Burke tortured and killed people. This was where the Lufthansa robbery began to take shape. Burke needed inside information, and he already had the perfect source: Louis Werner. Louis worked at JFK and knew the airport's security procedures from the inside. He gave Burke everything he needed. For months, Burke studied the airport, the security system, the vault, and the people working there. At the same time, he began choosing the men who would carry out the robbery. The first was Thomas De Simone, known as Tommy the Animal De Simone. He was violent, experienced, and one of Burke's closest associates. The second was Parnell Edwards. He had worked with Burke for more than 10 years. Then came Louis Cafora, whom Burke had met in prison. Cafora was known for being careful. Others soon joined them: Robert McMahon and Joseph Manry, both Air France employees at JFK. They had two things Burke needed. They had already worked with him on an earlier robbery, and they had legitimate access to areas of the airport outsiders couldn't reach. Burke also brought in his son, Frank Burke. He wanted the young man to learn the criminal trade. Then came Angelo Sepe and Joseph Joe Costa. The Bonanno family sent a young man named Vincent, and the Gambinos sent Paul Lacastri. The crew was complete. Now Burke called them together, and he laid down the rules. First, he believed the stolen money would be safe to spend. There would be no obvious trail connecting the cash to the robbers. Second, they would use 3 vehicles. The first would be the getaway vehicle. Henry Hill would steal it. Burke wanted a Ford Econoline 150 van big enough for the crew and the cash. The second vehicle would wait at a garage. Once the crew reached the garage, the money would be transferred into it and taken to their hideout. The getaway van would then be handed over to Parnell Edwards. His job was to destroy it. The third vehicle would be the lookout. Burke's son would sit inside it outside the airport and watch for trouble. The crew would also carry weapons. But Burke made one thing clear: they weren't supposed to use them. A shooting would turn a robbery into a murder investigation, and that would bring far more heat from the police. Burke had already studied the airport's security from every angle: outside, inside, the airline offices, and most importantly, the vault. But the vault presented a problem. It was buried inside a huge building filled with rooms and corridors that looked almost identical. If you didn't know the building, you could get lost quickly. Burke had a solution. They would take an employee hostage and make him lead them through the building. But there was another problem. The vault had 2 doors: an outer door and an inner door. The first door had to be closed before the second could be opened. Otherwise, the alarm would sound. The same rule applied when leaving. Get it wrong, and police and airport security would know someone was inside. Burke drilled the procedure into his men. There could be no mistakes. Then he gave them one final warning. Anyone whose carelessness put the operation at risk would pay with his life. It didn't matter which mafia family they came from. Burke would deal with them himself. Now they only needed one thing: the right night. The shipment had to be delayed. If it arrived late enough, the money would remain inside the airport overnight. That was when they would strike. Louis Werner was responsible for watching the shipments. The moment he knew one was delayed, he had to alert the crew. The message would be simple: the plane is delayed, the money will stay at the airport tonight. Tonight, we move. Then came December 10th, 1978. A shipment was due at JFK, but evening came, then night, and the money still hadn't arrived. Louis knew what that meant. The shipment was running late, and if it arrived after hours, the money would stay at JFK until morning. Louis dug deeper. The shipment contained roughly $2 million in cash, around $9.1 million today. He passed the information to Krugman. Krugman passed it to Henry Hill. Henry passed it to James Burke. The robbery was now in motion, but they needed one final confirmation. The money had to land, and it had to reach the vault. Later that night, the aircraft finally touched down at JFK. Louis stayed late to watch the shipment arrive himself. Once he saw it, he left and met Krugman. Krugman needed only one answer. Had the money arrived? Yes, that was enough. The message reached Burke. His crew was already waiting at his club. Now they were ready to move. Burke's son headed to JFK first. The getaway van was prepared. Its license plates had been changed to make it harder to trace. Burke himself stayed behind. He wouldn't go to the airport. He wouldn't drive the getaway vehicle. His job was waiting at the garage, where the stolen money would eventually be transferred into the second vehicle. Before the crew left, Burke went over the plan one last time. Everything had to happen exactly as planned. The Air France employees would lead them through the airport entrance. That was why Burke had chosen them. They already worked there. They sat at the front of the getaway van, their appearances altered so security wouldn't recognize them. At around 9:10 p.m., the van reached the JFK entrance gate. The Air France employees showed their identification cards. The photographs had been replaced to match their altered appearances. At the time, those photographs could be removed and replaced. The guards checked the IDs. Everything looked legitimate. The men explained that they were there to collect cargo. The guards waved them through. The van continued inside. 2 minutes later, they reached the parking spot Louis had given them. It was around 9:12 p.m. The other men put on their masks. The parking area was restricted. Ordinary vehicles weren't supposed to be there, but that was exactly why Burke had chosen it. Sooner or later, someone would come to investigate, and that's exactly what they wanted. They needed an employee, someone who knew the building, someone who could lead them to the vault. The plan worked. An employee named Kerry Whalen noticed the unfamiliar van. He walked over to investigate. The lights were off. The windows were heavily tinted. Kerry couldn't see inside, but the men could see him. He approached the van and tried to figure out who was inside. Then he knocked on the window. Nothing. He moved toward the back, and suddenly, both doors flew open. Before Kerry could react, a gun was pointed at him. He was ordered inside. The moment he climbed in, he found himself surrounded by masked men. Then came the detail that terrified him. They knew his name. Kerry immediately understood. These men hadn't chosen him at random. They had studied him. They knew exactly who he was. He agreed to cooperate and begged them not to hurt his family. The robbers assured him that his family was under their control too. They moved the van closer to the cargo entrance. Louis Werner had already given them the information they needed, and the airport guards were about to take their usual break. Everything was going according to plan. The crew got out with Kerry. They opened the cargo door without even needing his help. That frightened him even more. It made him believe they had someone on the inside. Once inside, the men kept their voices low. Then another employee heard them. He came to investigate, but before he reached them, he called out to a colleague by name. The robbers heard him. They ducked into a nearby room. Then they gave Kerry an order. Call him over. Make him think you need help. Kerry did exactly that. The employee walked in and found himself surrounded by armed men. They tied his hands. They taped his mouth shut. Then the crew continued toward the night shift staff. Burke had warned them not to waste time. They needed someone who knew the building, so they used Kerry. When they reached the break room, the crew stormed inside. Weapons drawn, everyone was ordered to freeze. The sight of Kerry, bleeding from the face, made the employees even more afraid. The robbers tied them up. Then they called each person by name. The employees realized just how much these men already knew about them. But the crew still needed one person, Rudy Eric. According to Louis Werner, Rudy was the only man who knew how to open the vault. So one of the employees was ordered to call him. He told Rudy there was an emergency. Rudy came immediately. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The moment he entered the break room, he was surrounded and taken hostage. The robbers gave him one instruction: take us to the vault. Rudy knew what that meant. He also knew the vault had security systems designed to catch anyone who made a mistake. For a moment, he considered deliberately triggering the alarm, but he knew the robbers were armed. If he tried anything, they might kill him. So he cooperated. Rudy led them to the vault. He entered the access codes. The first door opened. The robbers went inside and began taking the cash. They didn't touch anything else. They took only the money they had come for. Then they reached the second door. Rudy moved toward it. The robbers stopped him. The first door had to be closed before the second could open. Otherwise, the alarm would sound. Rudy couldn't believe it. These men knew the system. They knew exactly how the vault worked. He closed the first door, then opened the second. Behind it was even more money. The crew moved in and began collecting the cash. They carried the bundles back toward the space between the two doors. Then Rudy tried something else. He left the second door open and moved toward the first. The robbers caught him immediately. They knew what he was trying to do. Rudy was ordered to close the second door first. He did. And the crew got the money out without triggering the alarm. So far, everything had gone exactly as planned. The cash was loaded onto carts. The carts were pushed through the same door the crew had used to enter. Then the money was loaded into the getaway van. One robber stayed behind to guard the hostages. By 10:16 p.m., the money was loaded. The crew gave the hostages one final warning. Don't call anyone. Don't raise the alarm. Not until 10:30. That would give them enough time to get out of the airport. Kerry asked about his family. The robbers told him they were safe, but only if everyone stayed quiet. If anyone called the police before 10:30, they warned, his family would be in danger. Kerry believed them. So did the others. They stayed silent. Meanwhile, the robbers headed for the airport exit, the main gate, the most heavily guarded point. They had the money. They had escaped the vault. They had avoided the alarm. But one final obstacle remained. Could they get through the gate? And that's where we'll leave part 1, because the robbery wasn't over yet. The most dangerous part was still ahead.